He knew something was wrong the moment he saw the carpet bag in her hand again. Silas Boone stopped in the cabin doorway and stared at Lucy Bell like a man had just been hit in the chest and needed a second to understand it. For weeks, that old bag had stayed shoved beneath the barn cot where she first slept. Now it sat at her feet, buckled shut, with her shawl folded over the top. She was not crying. She was not angry. That made it worse. She only stood there with that same straight back she always carried, like leaving and breaking were two things she had learned to do without sound. Silas had laughed at her once when she came to his land with dust on her hem and hunger in her bones. He was not laughing now. If she walked out, he knew with a cold kind of certainty that the whole place would feel empty in a way it never had before. He swallowed and asked the only thing that mattered. Was she going because he had failed to give her one good reason to stay? Lucy did not answer right off. Her fingers stayed wrapped around the handle of the bag. Her face was calm, but her eyes were not. He had seen that look before in half-starved horses and men leaving for war. It was the look of something bracing for pain before it arrived. Silas took one step into the room, then another. He did not ask where she thought she would go. He already knew, nowhere good. That was what made his voice come out rough when he said her name. She lifted her chin. The fire cracked low behind her. Neither of them moved. And in that heavy silence, Silas Boone found himself dragged back to the first day she had come walking out of the red dirt toward his fence line like trouble wrapped in a blue dress. That had been late summer, when the dry ground baked hard and the wind came down off the bighorns with a bite that seemed too sharp for August. Silas had been riding the south fence, half thinking about a broken gate and half thinking about nothing at all, when he saw her moving along the road with a limp in one step and a busted carpet bag knocking against her skirt. She was small from a distance, smaller up close, thin shoulders, dust on her bonnet, boots that had given up long before she had. She looked like the sort of wanderer who lasted one hard week out west and then disappeared into a ditch or a grave. He had pulled his bay to a stop and called down that he was not hiring and did not need another mouth to feed. She had looked up at him without a bit of pleading in her face and said she was not asking for work. She was asking for water. It caught him wrong for a second, not because of what she asked, but because of how she asked it. No quiver in her voice, no show, just plain words. Silas had climbed down with a sigh and led her to the well house. He had expected her to snatch the dipper and gulp like an animal. Instead, she drank slow and careful, like manners were the last good thing no one had managed to beat out of her. That made him study her harder. When he asked her name, she told him it was Lucy Bell Harper and said she had come from Kansas. He asked what sort of fool walk brought her all the way to his patch of Wyoming. She told him she had come on foot. He laughed then. He could still hear the sound of it, too easy, too quick. The laugh of a man who thought he understood what he was looking at. He had told her she could sleep one night in the barn if she kept clear of his things and his horses. She told him she was not helpless. He had muttered that she was something else entirely. At the time, he meant stubborn. He did not know yet that stubborn could look a lot like courage when it refused to die. The next morning she was still there. By sunrise she had swept the loose hay into a tidy corner, filled 2 water buckets, and fed the chickens from a split sack he had left by the shed. He stood by the porch, coffee in hand, and watched her work with quiet annoyance. He told himself she was making herself useful so she could squeeze another night out of him. He had seen drifters do worse. Still, there was something about the way she moved. No flutter, no fishing for praise. She did not once glance over to see if he noticed. By the 3rd day she had fixed a sagging hinge on the chicken coop with a bent nail and a strip of leather. On the 4th she was chopping kindling with a rhythm so steady it made him tired just watching. That was when he asked if she planned to keep acting like the place belonged to her. She planted the axe, rested both hands on the handle, and said she knew full well it did not. Then he asked if she meant to stay. She said she had nowhere else. He reminded her that she had promised to move on. She said she had lied. Silas had no answer for that, not one worth speaking. So that night he let her sit at his table instead of eating alone in the barn. She took her place quiet as ever and ate beans, salt pork, and stale bread like it was the finest spread she had seen in years. Her back stayed straight. Her hands were clean. She thanked him with a nod instead of a smile. That was the first night he asked about her people. There was no husband. No father worth naming. Her mother had died the year before. After that, her stepfather sold what little they had and ran off with the money. He left her and her younger brother behind with empty cupboards and a pile of debt. When Silas asked about the boy, her face did not change much. That was what made it hit harder. She said his name was Owen, said he had been 9, said the sheriff called it fever, but she knew better. Hunger had eaten the strength out of him before sickness finished the job. She had buried him behind the schoolhouse because nobody else would do it right. Silas had stopped eating after that. He had lived through war. He had seen men split open by shot and shell. He had buried his own brother under a cheap marker in Colorado after a mine gave way. But the picture of a girl hardly more than grown digging a grave for a hungry child sat in his chest and stayed there. Lucy looked at him across the lamplight and told him she was not asking him to fix any part of her life. She only needed a place where she did not vanish. He had nodded once and told her all right. After that, she became part of his days so slowly he did not catch it at first. She patched a tear in the feed sack. She cleaned his cabin floor, though he told her not to bother. She learned the moods of his sorrel gelding faster than most hired hands ever did. One afternoon he came back from the north pasture and found her sighting down his Winchester at a stump 50 yards off. She fired once and split the bark near dead center. When he asked where she learned that, she said her mother had taught her before sickness took hold of the house. Then she handed the rifle back like she had no need to boast. She was unlike any woman he had known, not softer, not harder, just built from a kind of wire that did not bend easy. Silas found himself talking to her before long. At first it was little things, weather, fences, a lame cow. Then one evening on the porch with the light going copper over the pasture, he heard himself tell her about riding dispatch in the war, about how he had gone east as a boy with too much anger in him and come back with even more, about how there had been no home waiting when the fighting ended, his father dead, his mother gone to kin in Missouri, nothing left worth claiming. So he had taken the last of his pay, headed west, and bought land rougher than sense. Lucy listened the way she did everything else. Fully. Sometimes she answered with stories of a creek behind her childhood house, of stealing extra biscuits for Owen when the pantry thinned out, of her mother singing while sheets flapped white on the line. Those were the only times Silas saw her voice soften, like memory still held a warm room somewhere inside her, even if she no longer trusted herself to live there. Then came the storm. It rolled in near dark with a sky the color of iron and thunder that shook the window glass. Silas stepped inside after securing the horses and found Lucy standing by the cabin window with her arms folded tight. She looked calm until the next crack split the sky. Then he saw it, the small jump in her shoulders, the breath she took too fast. He asked if storms bothered her. She said yes. That was all. He moved closer and told her to come sit by the fire then. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room. They sat on the floorboards with the flames throwing gold over the walls. Outside, rain slammed the roof hard enough to sound like fists. Inside, her knee brushed his, then stayed there. He could feel the tension in her like a pulled rope. So he reached for her hand. She let him take it. He told her she was not alone anymore. He had not planned to say it. The words just came. She turned her face toward him then, and in the firelight he saw something in her eyes shift. Not all the way to trust, but toward it. Toward him. When she leaned her head to his shoulder, he stayed still as stone because moving felt like the sort of mistake a man made only once. That was the night something real began. He knew it, even if he did not yet know its shape. And now, weeks later, standing in the cabin with that old carpet bag back in her hand, Silas could feel the weight of it pressing on his ribs. Whatever had begun by the fire, whatever had grown through long workdays and quiet meals and words spoken after dark, he was no longer strong enough to lose it lightly. Lucy drew in a breath at last and looked at him fully. Then she said she had found a letter on the porch with his name on it. Silas frowned and held out his hand. Lucy did not give him the letter at once. She kept it between her fingers and looked at him with a kind of careful stillness that made his gut tighten. He asked where she had found it. She said it had been tucked beneath the porch rail where the wind would not take it. No stamp. No proper seal. Just his name written across the front in a hand neither of them knew. He took it then. The paper felt cheap and damp from the morning air. When he unfolded it, his eyes moved fast over the lines and the blood in his face seemed to drop away. Lucy watched him without speaking. That alone told him she already knew it was bad. He had never been good at hiding much from her. He read the note again, slower this time. It said a man from Laramie claimed rights on a wheelwright shop his cousin had once tried to sell. The writer believed Silas Boone had coin enough now to buy in before the property was taken by strangers. If he wanted it, he had to come soon. If he did not, the chance would pass. At the bottom was the name of his cousin Jonah, the last kin he had left by blood. Lucy asked if it was family. Silas nodded once and folded the paper hard down the middle. She asked if he meant to go. He did not answer. He set the letter on the table and moved to the stove as if more coffee might settle something in him. It did not. The truth was plain enough. He had never wanted town life. Never wanted a shop, a counter, a roof between himself and honest weather. But blood had a way of reaching across years and taking hold. So did old guilt. Lucy rested her hand on the back of a chair. Her carpet bag still stood by the door. Silas looked at it again and asked the thing that had been eating him since he walked in. Was she packing because of the letter? She lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back up and said no. Not because of the letter itself. Because she had heard enough over the past week to know what people in town were beginning to say. That made him go still. He asked who had been talking. She said Mrs. Ketter from the neighboring spread had come by with a sack of onions and too much interest in the cabin. She smiled with her mouth and measured Lucy with her eyes. She asked if Lucy was the new help. Then she asked why the new help sat at the table instead of the barn. Later in town, the mercantile clerk had been polite to Lucy's face and cold after. Folks had started doing the math. A young woman living alone with a man out on a ranch. No wedding. No kin, no protection but his word. Lucy had lived long enough to know how fast a town could decide what kind of woman that made her. Silas felt anger rise hot and quick. Not at her, at them. At the thought of strangers weighing her life in their dirty hands. He asked why she had not told him before. She said because the words would not have changed anything. People like talk. Winter was coming. She could survive gossip if that was all it was. But if he had kin calling from back east and a chance to leave this place for work under a roof, she would not be the reason he lost it. He stared at her then as if she had spoken nonsense. She took a breath and said she had packed because she did not want him making choices with one eye on her and the other on what folks might think. Silas laughed once, but there was no humor in it. It came out low and rough. He told her that was a foolish thing to decide for him. She did not flinch. She said maybe. But she had spent too much of her life waiting for a man to change his mind after calling her a burden. She would not stand in the middle of his room like a hopeful child and wait for the same thing here. For a long moment, neither of them said another word. The fire shifted. Wind tapped the window. Silas looked at the carpet bag, then at Lucy's face, and something inside him settled with a force that surprised even him. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. Close enough to see the tired places around her eyes. Close enough to notice the way her hand still held the chair like she needed the wood steady beneath her fingers. He told her he had no wish to buy a shop. None. He told her the letter had stirred up old duty, nothing more. A cousin offering a chance was not the same as a man wanting it. This ranch was his home. The land, the cabin, the barn, the cold, the work, all of it. Then he said the harder thing, the truer thing. It had stopped being only his home some time ago. Lucy went very still after that. He said if she wanted to leave because she did not care for him, he would not stop her. If she wanted to leave because staying scared her, he would understand that too. But if she was packing because of town talk or some imagined sacrifice on his behalf, then she was dead wrong about him. He had laughed at her the day she arrived because he did not know what he was looking at. Now he did. He was looking at the one person who had walked into his life and made the place feel lived in instead of merely owned. Lucy shut her eyes for a second. When she opened them, they shone in the firelight, though no tears fell. She said she did care for him, more than was wise. That was the trouble. It was easier to leave before wanting turned into need. Easier to step off while she still had some pride left. Silas answered that pride had kept plenty of people hungry and alone. He stepped nearer and asked if she really believed he wanted a quieter cabin more than he wanted her in it. She swallowed and looked down. Then she said she did not know what to believe when good things came. They had never stayed. That went through him like a blade. His voice gentled without him trying. He told her that maybe the good thing here was not the cabin or the food or even the land. Maybe it was this. Him standing there asking her not to go. Her still being honest enough to tell him she was afraid. He said he did not need her because she worked hard, though she did. He did not want her near because the place ran smoother with her in it, though it did. He wanted her because when she was gone from a room, he felt it. Because every plan in his head had started making room for her before he had even named what that meant. Lucy sat down slowly on the chair behind her as if her knees had lost some strength. She looked at the bag by the door, then back at him. He reached down, took the handle of the carpet bag and set it flat on the floor by the hearth. Not hidden, not thrown aside, just no longer aimed at the door. When he straightened, she asked in a voice so soft he nearly missed it what he meant to tell his cousin. He said the truth, that he was staying where he belonged. After that, the room changed. Not all at once, not like lightning, more like ice beginning to loosen under spring sun. Lucy let out a breath that sounded as if she had been holding it for days. Silas crouched in front of her and laid one hand over both of hers. He asked if she would stay through winter at least and stop speaking like a guest who might vanish by dawn. She looked at him a long while before answering. Then she said if she stayed, she would not stay half-hearted. She would plan for the cellar, ration the flour, mend what needed mending, and speak her mind when he was being mule-headed. He told her he would expect no less. That finally brought the smallest curve to her mouth. They ate supper late that evening. Simple stew, cornbread, and coffee black enough to stand a spoon in. Yet the room felt different than it ever had before. Lucy sat across from him with a little more ease in her shoulders. Silas found himself watching the lamp light catch the stray wisps of hair at her temple. Neither of them said much. They did not need to. Some truths once spoken made quiet feel fuller instead of empty. The next morning, frost silvered the grass and the air carried the warning edge of a harder season coming on. Lucy was up before him, as usual. He found her in the root cellar, kneeling beside the crates with a scrap of old ledger paper in her hand. She had already counted potatoes, onions, dried beans, coffee, sugar, and the last of the salt pork. She looked over her shoulder and told him if they were careful, the stores would hold well into the new year, but only if he stopped feeding bacon scraps to the dog like he had money buried in the yard. Silas leaned against the cellar frame and smiled despite himself. He asked who had put her in charge. She answered that no one had. That was the problem with men. They saw a winter coming and called it weather instead of work. He laughed then, a real laugh this time, and the sound bounced off the cellar walls warm and easy. Lucy looked at him, surprised for half a second, then shook her head. He had once laughed because he thought she was a fool. Now he laughed because he could not remember how this place had ever been bearable without her. That afternoon, he rode into town alone with the letter in his pocket. He meant to send a reply westbound with the post rider and buy flour, lamp oil, and seed catalog pages if any were left. But the minute he stepped onto the boardwalk, he felt the eyes, the glances, the sort of half-hidden attention that passed between people who believed their business was everyone's business. Silas tied his horse outside the mercantile and walked in with his jaw set. Old Mr. Pritchard stood behind the counter weighing nails, and two women from the church circle were pretending not to listen while listening to everything. Pritchard asked after the weather, then after the cattle. Then, like a coward working his way around to the point, after the young woman staying out at Boone's place. Silas set the flour sack on the counter harder than he meant to and said her name was Lucy Bell Harper. He said it plain so they all heard it. Then he added that folks would do well to use it instead of whispering like crows. The store went still. Pritchard cleared his throat and said no offense was meant. Silas replied that offense had been taken all the same. He paid in cash, left the letter for the writer and walked back out without another word. When he rode home near sundown, Lucy was in the yard splitting kindling. The light had gone gold over the pasture, and each fall of the axe looked clean and sure. She glanced up at the sound of hooves. Silas did not say what happened in town right away. He only climbed down, took the axe from her hand, and touched her wrist once before carrying the wood to the porch. She watched him with that quiet look he had come to know. Later, after supper, when the fire had burned low, he told her every word. Lucy said nothing for a while. Then she asked why he bothered. Silas looked at her across the fire and said because nobody would stand in a room and speak of her like she was some nameless thing while he still had breath enough to answer them. Her eyes lowered at that. When she looked back up, the fear was still there. So was something else, something slower, warmer, the kind of faith that grows not from promises but from proof. Outside, the wind dragged over the roof. Inside, the cabin held. And as Lucy sat there with the firelight on her face, Silas had the strong feeling that winter would test them both harder than either yet knew. Winter did not come all at once. It crept in by inches. First the mornings turned mean, with frost clinging white to the fence rails and the water trough skinned over in glassy sheets by dawn. Then the wind sharpened and stayed sharp. By the second week of October, the ridge beyond the pasture held a pale line of snow that did not melt by noon. Lucy stood out by the paddock before sunrise one morning with her shawl pulled tight and her breath rising in little clouds. Silas watched from the porch while he tugged on his gloves. She was looking east again, not with hope, not exactly, more like habit. Like some part of her body still expected trouble to come walking over the horizon. He went down the steps and asked if she was waiting on Kansas to send for her. She did not smile. She said no one back there had much reason to remember she lived. Then she added that sometimes a person kept looking behind simply because they had spent too long being chased by whatever came next. Silas stood beside her at the fence and let that sit between them. The horses shifted in the cold. Somewhere out past the creek a crow called once and went quiet. He asked if she was still thinking about leaving. Lucy answered with more honesty than comfort. She said not every day. Only the bad ones. The ones where the place felt too good and her chest got tight from waiting for it to be taken. Silas leaned his arms on the fence rail. He told her he knew something about that feeling. After the war, he had slept with his boots on for near 2 years because some part of him believed any roof he slept beneath might be gone by morning. She turned then and looked at him with surprise, like she had not pictured fear fitting inside a man built as broad and steady as him. He said fear looked foolish from the outside most times. That did not make it less real. Lucy's face softened a little. The silence that followed was not easy, but it was shared. That made all the difference. They spent the day moving cattle down to the lower pasture before snow made the upper trail a misery. Lucy rode the gray gelding he had started letting her use regular, and she handled the horse with the same quiet command she seemed to bring to everything. She never shouted at the herd, never flapped or fussed. She just moved where she needed to move, saw trouble before it started, and turned a stubborn steer with one sharp call and the angle of her body. Silas had worked beside men who had been on ranches half their lives and made twice the noise with half the sense. Lucy was better than most of them and knew it, though she never said so. At the creek crossing, a layer of fresh ice had formed along the bank. Lucy slid from the saddle without being asked, found a flat stone, and began breaking the edge loose so the lead cows could drink and cross without balking. Silas sat his horse and watched her. The cold had reddened her hands, but her movements stayed neat and sure. He asked if she had ever thought of teaching. She glanced over her shoulder and asked what in heaven she would teach. He said horses, stubborn men, may be the proper way to survive on too little and still keep a straight back. She shook her head, but he saw the corner of her mouth stir. When they got home, she lifted the saddle down from the gelding and winced before she could stop herself. Silas stepped closer at once and asked if she was hurt. She told him she was only sore in places she did not know existed until ranch life introduced her to them. He reached past her to take the tack, and their shoulders brushed. It was the sort of small touch that had once made both of them go still. Now it only changed the air a little. He said she did not have to ride every day. She looked up at him, serious as ever, and said she wanted to. Not because she had to prove herself, because she liked it. That struck him harder than it should have. So much of her life had been survival that simple wanting still sounded new when it came out of her mouth. That evening she sat by the fire mending one of his trail shirts where a branch had split the shoulder seam. Her stitches were tiny and even, better than any he had ever managed on his own. Silas sat across from her with his boots stretched toward the hearth and watched the needle flash in the light. After a while he asked if she ever let herself think about what came next. She kept sewing for several heartbeats before answering. She said it was easier not to. Looking too far ahead made disappointment easier to aim. He asked what if something good was waiting. That made her stop. The room went very still except for the fire. Then she said if something good was waiting, she would not know what to do with it once it arrived. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said she would not have to know all at once. She lowered her eyes to the shirt again, but her hands had slowed. He could tell the words reached someplace in her she did not trust yet. The first real snow came 3 nights later. It hit fast after sundown, driven sideways by a wind so hard it shook the loose plank at the back of the shed. Silas had just gotten the animals settled when he saw Lucy by the cabin window again, arms crossed tight over herself. She did not like storms. He knew that much. Snow made something different rise in her. Not panic, not exactly, more like a deep old grief. He set another log on the fire and asked if she wanted tea. She said yes, and the single word sounded thin. They sat at the table with steaming cups between their hands, while the snow battered the world outside into white noise. After a long stretch, Lucy spoke without looking up. She told him the winter after her mother died had been the worst one. Not because the cold was colder than any other year, but because there had been no one left in the house who knew how to soften it. Her stepfather drank what coin they had. Her brother coughed through the nights. She would lie awake listening to him and count how many sticks of wood were left, how many potatoes in the cellar, how many mornings until something ran out. She said hunger changed the sound of a house, made every quiet feel dangerous. Silas listened and did not interrupt. She said that was why storms still got inside her head. Not because of thunder, because bad weather always seemed to arrive with a hand already around her throat. When she finished, she stared into her cup like she had said too much. Silas got up from his chair, walked to her side of the table and rested one hand at the back of her neck. It was a simple touch, firm, warm. He told her there would be wood enough here, food enough. And if the storm lasted 3 days or 10, she would not face it alone. She set the cup down and leaned into him before she could think better of it. He drew her up from the chair and held her there by the fire while the wind shook the cabin. She fit against him in a way that felt both strange and immediate, like he had been walking around with an empty place in himself and only just learned its shape. Lucy's hands came to rest at his coat front. After a while she tipped her face up. He could see fear there, and trust, and the kind of wanting that looked almost painful in its carefulness. He touched her cheek with the back of his fingers and asked if this was all right. She answered by kissing him. It was not hurried. That was what stayed with him. It was gentle and certain at once, like she had argued with herself long enough and had finally grown tired of losing. Silas kissed her back slowly, one hand still cupping the side of her face, the other steady at her waist. When they parted, Lucy kept close, her forehead nearly touching his chest. He could feel her breath through his shirt. Outside, snow kept pounding the dark. Inside, something in both of them had crossed a line that could not be walked back. After that night, the world did not turn soft. If anything, it grew more real. Lucy still worked from dawn to dark. Silas still had fences to mend, stock to count, feed to haul, and weather to watch. But there was a new nearness between them. Not loud, not showy, built from the sort of things other people might miss. The way he set an extra biscuit on her plate without asking if she was hungry. The way she checked his gloves for worn seams and stitched them before he noticed. The way her hand sometimes found the back of his arm when she passed behind him in the narrow kitchen. The way he reached for her in the half-light before either had spoken a word. On Sunday, he hitched the wagon and took her into town again. She wore a borrowed wool coat from a widow up the road, and he could tell she sat straighter than usual, bracing herself before they even reached the first row of buildings. The boardwalks were slick. The air smelled of coal smoke, mule sweat, and cold iron. Silas climbed down first and came around to help her. He noticed not for the first time that Lucy always accepted help with a kind of caution, as though she still believed every offered hand carried a price. He gave her none, just steadied her and let go. Inside the mercantile she bought a length of muslin, a tin of buttons, lye soap, and 2 skeins of yarn dark as pine bark. She paid with coins she had earned mending fence rails for a ranch wife 3 miles over. Silas watched her count out the money exactly, not one bit shy, not one bit apologetic. At the counter, old Mr. Pritchard glanced between them and cleared his throat as if deciding whether to be brave or foolish. Before he could choose, Lucy turned and asked for calendula seeds if any were left from the last shipment. Pritchard blinked. Then he said he thought there might be 1 packet in the back. Silas nearly smiled. Lucy had a way of stepping clean over a man's assumptions and making him look silly for holding them. On the way out, snow started falling in small, soft gusts. They loaded the supplies into the wagon, and Silas drew the blanket over Lucy's knees before climbing up beside her. Once they were clear of town, she leaned against his shoulder without a word. He kept one hand on the reins and the other over hers beneath the blanket. The road home blurred white ahead of them. Neither of them spoke. They did not need speech for every truth anymore. A week later, when the ground had frozen hard enough to ring under boot heels, Silas found Lucy in the cellar again with her scrap of ledger paper. She had made columns now: flour, salt, beans, lamp oil, candles, lard. He crouched beside her and asked if she meant to run the place like a quartermaster. She said someone had to, seeing as the owner treated provisions like they appeared by prayer. He laughed softly and asked if she planned to stay all winter then. Lucy looked at the shelves instead of him. Then she said she had been hoping he would ask her to. He straightened slowly. The old boards creaked under his weight. The answer came simple. He said he was asking. She nodded once, still facing the jars and crates, but he saw the relief move through her shoulders like warmth through cold hands. That night she gave him a pair of mittens she had been sewing by lamplight from old leather and lined wool. He pulled them on and flexed his fingers. They fit near perfect. He asked when she had found the time. She said while he was sleeping or pretending not to notice. He looked at the neat stitching and knew she had not made them only because the old pair was worn. She had made them to last, to keep. The thought sat in his chest warm and steady. Later, long after the lamps were out, they lay together beneath heavy blankets with the wind tugging at the eaves. Lucy traced one finger over the back of his hand and asked him something in the dark. She asked if he had ever imagined this. Not her exactly, just this kind of life. Silas thought about it, about the long years before she arrived, about meals eaten alone, about silence that felt more like punishment than peace. Then he told her no. He had imagined land, work, maybe old age if luck bothered to allow it, but not this. Not a room that felt warm before the fire was lit. Not someone whose breathing he listened for in the night. Lucy was quiet after that. Then she said maybe that was why it mattered, because neither of them had expected it enough to spoil it by dreaming too big. He turned toward her in the dark and kissed her forehead. Outside, winter pressed close against the cabin walls. Inside, he held her and understood with a deepening certainty that the season ahead would not just test what they could survive. It would show them what they were building, even before either had found the courage to call it a future. By December, the days had gone short and gray. Light came late over the ranch and left early, as if even the sun had no wish to linger in that kind of cold. Snow drifted high along the north side of the barn, and the creek behind the pasture wore a hard white edge most mornings. Inside the cabin, The air held the smell of pine smoke, wool, coffee, and the faint clean scent of soap Lucy had shaved down to almost nothing. Silas had hauled in extra wood before the last storm, and Lucy had lined the worst cracks in the window frame with feed sack strips to keep the wind from slipping through. Their life had narrowed to warmth, chores, weather, and the quiet things that made a season bearable. One morning Silas woke to the sound of her reading aloud. Her voice was low and steady, carrying through the dim cabin as if the words had belonged there all along. She sat near the lamp with her knees drawn up and an old booklet in her lap, one she had found beneath a loose board weeks ago. The pages were yellowed, the binding half gone, but she handled it with care. Silas pushed himself up on one elbow and watched her without interrupting. Her hair was loose at the nape. Firelight and lamplight mixed over her shoulders. She looked like someone who had lived in that room for years, not months. After a while he asked if she always read like that. Lucy glanced over, surprised to find him awake. She said only when there was someone to hear it. Silas told her she read better than the schoolmaster back in Fort Kearney when he was a boy. She said she once had a teacher who made every child stand and read even if their voice shook. Said it taught a person how to carry words proper. Silas lay quiet for a beat, then asked whether she had ever thought of teaching for real. This time she did not laugh it off. She closed the booklet, rested it against her lap, and said she doubted any schoolhouse would have her. Not if people knew enough about her. Not if they asked the wrong questions. Silas sat up fully then. He said folks in town only knew what they made up. That was not the same as truth. Lucy looked down at the worn cover in her hands and answered that people often preferred the story that let them judge fastest. A woman living with a man without a preacher's blessing did not get much grace out here. Silas felt the weight of that settle between them. He had known it, but hearing her say it plain put a sharper edge on it. She stood and crossed to the window, where frost laced the glass in pale white veins. Then she asked the question that mattered. If he ever asked her to marry him, would it be because he meant it, or because it solved a town problem neatly? Silas stared at her back for a long second before answering. He told her if he ever asked, it would be because the place felt right with her in it, because he wanted her here in every season he had left, not because of gossip and not because she made the work easier, though both those things were true in their own way. Lucy turned then. Her face gave little away, but her eyes searched him hard. He rose from the bed and stood across from her, boots cold against the floorboards. She said if she ever said yes, he needed to understand something too. She would not become the kind of wife who sat quiet in a corner and nodded at everything. She had opinions. She argued when she thought she was right. She noticed waste, sloppiness, and foolish pride. A small smile moved through him then. He told her that sounded exactly like the woman already running half his house. That broke the tension enough to let them breathe again. That evening she sat at the table with a scrap of muslin and a bit of charcoal, sketching out a rough square with narrow lines crossing at the edges. Silas leaned on one elbow and asked what she was making. She told him it was a garden plan, a real one, not just seeds stuck in ground by hope, turnips along one side, beans where they would catch the longer light. Maybe calendula near the edge for burns and swelling if the seeds from town took. She talked softly, almost like she was afraid speaking too much hope aloud might scare it off. Silas watched her hand move over the cloth. Then he asked if she had been planning all this for herself or for both of them. Lucy looked up and answered with a kind of quiet honesty he had come to fear and value in equal measure. She said she had stopped knowing where the line was. The next morning Silas rode out alone to check the trap line and clear his head. Snow had crusted hard over the hills, and the cold bit through his coat in a way that made a man feel every year of his life at once. He found 2 empty snares and one holding a rabbit stiff with frost. On the ride back, he paused by the old cottonwood where the creek bent west and looked out over the land. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney in a steady ribbon. Somewhere inside, Lucy would be moving from stove to table to shelf, putting order where winter always tried to bring disorder. He realized then with a kind of quiet force that he no longer pictured the place without her. Not in spring, not in summer, not in any year he cared to imagine. When he came in with the rabbit near dusk, Lucy was kneeling by the hearth trying to coax flame from damp kindling. She glanced up and told him the wood was being stubborn. He set the rabbit on the table and crouched beside her. Their shoulders touched. He said he had been thinking while out by the creek. She answered that thinking could be dangerous in deep winter. He gave a low breath that might have been a laugh. Then he told her he wanted to write his cousin back proper, not just to refuse the shop. To tell him there was someone in his life worth naming. Lucy went still at that. She asked if he was sure. Silas said yes. Then, because he had learned she trusted truth best when it was plain, he added that he was sure in the only way that mattered. Not because he had all the answers, not because he knew what every next year would bring, but because he knew he was done pretending she was a passing season in his house. Lucy's face softened and tightened all at once. She brushed soot from her fingertips onto her apron and asked what exactly he planned to say. He told her he would say there was a woman on his ranch who had become the center of his days, and that he would rather freeze honest on his own land with her than sit warm behind a town counter without her. That made her blink fast once. She did not cry. Lucy almost never cried, but he saw something close to it move through her all the same. She reached for his hand, and he let her pull him up from the hearth. They stood there in the warm, dim room with snow pressing at the windows, and she laced her fingers through his as if trying to test whether the moment was real enough to hold. She said there was still a great deal she did not know how to do when it came to being wanted. Silas answered that he did not know much either. They could learn. A few days later, the storm that had been threatening all week finally settled over the valley in earnest. For 2 full days the world narrowed to white wind and the cabin walls. Silas could do little more than break trough ice, check the animals, and haul more wood. Lucy kept Stu going, patched another shirt of his, and read by lamplight when the evenings came on. The storm left them alone with each other in a way the busy months never had. There was nowhere to ride off to, no town errand to make, no neighboring chore to borrow, just the room, the weather, and the truth of what sat between them. On the second night, after supper, Lucy asked him something from across the table. She asked what he had been like before the war, not the man who came west, the boy before that. Silas leaned back and let out a breath through his nose. He told her he had been quicker to laugh and quicker to anger. He had thought strength meant never letting anyone see fear. He had believed most men were meant to take what they could hold and call that living. Lucy asked what changed. He looked into the lamp flame for a long beat before answering. He said war showed him how thin life was. Then the years after showed him how empty a life could be even when it lasted. That made her very quiet. Then she said she thought he had been lonely longer than he knew. Silas looked at her. The fire popped behind him. He told her she was likely right. Lucy lowered her eyes and said loneliness had a way of disguising itself as independence. You got used to lifting everything alone until help itself started to feel dangerous. That went so cleanly to the heart of things that neither of them spoke after. He rose from the table, came around behind her chair, and rested both hands on her shoulders. She leaned back into him without question. The silence there was not empty. It was recognition. Near midnight the wind dropped at last, leaving the world outside buried and still. They stood together by the window and looked out at the moonlight spread over the drifts, turning the whole ranch pale silver. Lucy said snow made even a hard place look merciful. Silas answered that mercy and trouble often wore the same coat at first glance. She tipped her head against his shoulder and asked if he always had to sound like an old man when trying to be wise. He let out a real laugh then, warm, easy, the kind that seemed to surprise both of them. She smiled after hearing it, and the sight of it hit him with strange force. Lucy did not smile often. When she did, it felt earned. Christmas passed without much ceremony. No church visit, no feast, just coffee, biscuits, a little more bacon than usual, and a small gift each. Lucy gave him a scarf she had sewn from leftover wool. He gave her a hair comb carved from antler on long winter evenings when she thought he was fixing harness straps. She ran her thumb over the smooth shape and looked up at him with startled tenderness. It was not fancy. Silas knew that, but it was made by his hands for hers. She wore it the next day. He noticed and said nothing. Some things were better left to settle quietly. By the first week of January, talk of marriage had not come up again directly, but it was there all the same. In the way he looked at her when she moved about the cabin, in the way she planned for spring on scraps of muslin and ledger paper, in the way they had both begun speaking of next season as if both would surely be there for it. One night, lying beneath blankets while the last coals dimmed red in the stove, Lucy told him something she had never said plain before. She said the hardest part of her old life had not been hunger, though there had been plenty of that. It had been the feeling that every roof over her head could be lost by morning if she failed to be useful enough. Silas turned toward her in the dark and listened. She said she still did not always know how to separate being needed from being loved. He took her hand beneath the blanket. Then he told her he would spend the rest of his life proving the difference if that was what it took. She made no answer for several breaths. Then she moved closer and pressed her forehead to his chest. Outside, the cold held the world in place. Inside, something in both of them had shifted again, not with the shock of first desire this time. With the deeper weight of promise, even before any formal vow had been spoken. And by the time sleep finally took him, Silas knew one thing with complete certainty. Winter had not driven them apart. It had shown him, day by day, that Lucy Bell was no passing guest under his roof. She was the woman he wanted beside him when the thaw finally came. The thaw began in secret. At first, it was only a softness in the air near midday. Then the snow along the south fence started to sink into itself, turning gray at the edges. The creek broke open next, with a low groan under the ice that carried across the pasture like the land clearing its throat after a long silence. By March, the path between the cabin and barn had turned to mud and old roots, and every step outside came with the sound of wet earth pulling at boots. Lucy stood on the porch one morning with her hands on her hips, watching Silas pace off a stretch of ground near the south edge of the property. He had a coil of rope over one shoulder and a handful of stakes in his hand. The sun was thin but real. The sort of spring light that did not warm much yet, but still made a body believe in April. Lucy did not call out to him. She just watched. Her face set in that quiet way he had learned meant her mind was working harder than her mouth. When Silas finally came in for supper that night, tired through the bones and streaked with mud to the knee, she set a plate in front of him and asked what exactly he had been measuring. Silas tore off a piece of cornbread and looked at her across the table. Then he told her there was a draw near the southern line with shelter from the north wind. Good soil, better than the patch near the shed. He had been thinking on a fence, maybe a garden, maybe more than that. Lucy rested her spoon against the bowl and asked him what more meant. He answered plain. It meant building proper. The cabin had done its work, but he had built it years ago for one man with rough habits and fewer plans. He wanted something else now, something fit for two people to grow old in. Lucy did not answer right away. The room stayed still except for the stove ticking low behind them. Then she pushed back her chair, crossed the floor, and knelt beside him. It was not a dramatic thing. It was Lucy, so nothing ever was. She simply rested one hand on his knee and said that if they were building new, she wanted a window facing east. She wanted morning light to be the first thing through the room. Silas looked down at her hand and then at her face. The certainty in it undid something inside him. He told her then they would make the east window the biggest one in the house. The work began the following week. They borrowed a wagon from a ranch 2 miles over and hauled rough-cut timber from the mill near Sheridan Crossing. The road was rutted deep from thaw and wagon wear, and the horses fought the mud most of the day. Lucy sat beside him wrapped in her coat with a scarf pulled close under her chin. She had been quieter than usual all morning. Not unhappy, just far away in her thoughts. Silas asked once if she was tired. She said no. He let it go. Lucy spoke when she meant to, and pressing her too soon usually only pushed her deeper into herself. They were nearly home when she finally said there was something she had been keeping. Silas glanced at her and slowed the team without fully meaning to. The wagon creaked under the timber load. A wind had picked up from the west, carrying the damp smell of thawed grass and creek water. Lucy kept one hand folded over the other in her lap as she spoke. She said she had not wanted to tell him until she was sure, had not wanted to place hope in the middle of the room too soon and then be forced to watch it die. Silas felt his chest tighten. He asked if she was ill. She shook her head. Then she turned and met his eyes full. She told him she thought she was carrying a child. For a second he only stared. The horses shifted in their traces. The wagon rocked once and settled. The whole world seemed to narrow to her face, to the steady way she held his gaze while waiting for whatever came next. Silas took a breath that did not feel like enough. Then he reached for her hand. He asked if she was sure. Lucy nodded once and said as sure as she could be without a doctor standing in the road. It had been near 2 months since she had known herself as regular. She was not afraid exactly, not like she would have been once. But she needed him to hear it from her first, not guess it from her being tired or sick to her stomach. Silas brought her knuckles to his mouth and kissed them. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Was she all right with it? Lucy looked down at their joined hands and said yes, more than all right, just startled by how much she wanted to believe in it. Silas let out a breath that shook loose something deep in him. He told her she would not be facing any part of it alone, not the waiting, not the fear, not the birth, not any day after. Lucy closed her fingers around his and held tight. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, but it was a new silence, full of wonder, full of the kind of careful happiness that does not yet trust itself to stand upright. When Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hand stayed at the small of her back half a heartbeat longer than before. He felt absurdly aware of every loose board in the porch, every tool left where it could trip her, every draft in the cabin. The place seemed suddenly too rough for what it now held. That night, long after Lucy had fallen asleep with one hand tucked beneath her cheek, Silas lay awake staring up at the rafters. He thought about fathers. About the one he had lost at 14, and the years before that when the man's temper had often arrived faster than his tenderness. He thought about his brother buried in Colorado, about the war, about every hard thing that had taught him how quickly a life could be broken. Then he turned and looked at Lucy sleeping beside him. The moon laid a pale stripe across the blanket. Her face was peaceful in a way it rarely was when awake. Silas rested his hand lightly over hers and understood that fear had changed shape. It was no longer only the fear of loss. It was the fear of loving something so deeply that the whole world could wound you through it. By mid-April, the new house had taken shape. The beam frame stood. The walls were up. The roof waited on the last run of shingles. Lucy moved through those weeks with a steadier slowness, though she refused to be idle. She still counted stores, still mended, still planned the garden, though Silas had started taking the heavier buckets from her without argument. She let him more often now, not because she had gone soft, but because something in her had finally begun to trust that accepting care did not erase her strength. One warm morning after the final frost had passed, Lucy planted calendula by the edge of the new porch. Silas watched her kneeling in the dirt with careful hands and thought there was no sight on earth finer. She looked up and caught him staring. Instead of lowering her eyes, she smiled faintly and told him if he intended to stand there useless, he could at least fetch the water pail. He laughed and did as told. It was around then the question of marriage stopped circling and came to rest between them for good, not because town talk had vanished. It had not because the baby forced it. Silas would have married her without that news and knew she understood it. It happened one evening in the half-finished house when the light came through the east window opening just as she had wanted. They stood inside the bare frame with sawdust underfoot and spring wind moving through the unfinished walls. Lucy looked around with one hand resting low against herself and said she had never thought she would have a home she was allowed to help shape. Silas answered that he did not want her merely helping shape it. He wanted her name on it, her life in it, her seasons in it. Then he asked her to marry him. He did not drop to one knee. There was no ring box and no polished speech, just a man standing in a new house with honest dust on his boots and truth in his voice. Lucy stared at him for a long moment, and he saw all her old fear pass through her face in one soft shadow. Then he saw it ease. She stepped closer and laid both hands against his chest. She said yes. Not as a gasp, not as a surprise, as a choice, firm and clear. The kind of yes a person speaks when they mean to build the rest of their life around it. The wedding was small. A preacher rode out from Dry Creek with a Bible and a red nose from too much wind. The neighbor woman who had once eyed Lucy too closely now brought a pie and 3 clean plates. Silas wore his best shirt. Lucy wore a wool dress she had altered with her own hands until it sat just right across her growing middle. They stood under a pale spring sky with the half-finished house behind them and said what needed saying. No more, no less. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Silas kissed her with a tenderness so open it made the little knot of witnesses look away. That evening, after the last horse had ridden off and the quiet came back over the land, they stood together on the porch of the new house. The boards still smelled of fresh timber and pitch. Wind moved through the pasture grass in slow green waves. Lucy rested against his side and placed his hand over her belly. She said if the baby was a girl, she had been thinking of the name Ruth. Silas looked down at her and asked if she truly believed it was a girl. Lucy said she did not know, only that the name felt gentle and strong both. He nodded once and told her then Ruth it would be if Ruth was who arrived. She leaned into him more fully then and said she had never thought life would bring her this far. Silas pressed his lips to her hair and answered that life had done very little of it on its own. She had walked her own battered feet all the way to his land and stayed when staying was the harder thing. She had earned every board, every seed, every morning light coming through that east window. Lucy did not argue. She only closed her eyes and stood there with him while the evening settled soft around them. And for the first time since she had stepped through his gate with that broken carpet bag in hand, the future no longer felt like something passing overhead. It felt like ground beneath her feet. Spring opened slow and honest after that. The grass came in first, thin and pale along the lower pasture, then fuller where the ground held more water. The cottonwoods along the creek shook out new leaves, and the air lost that hard winter bite that seemed to live in a man's teeth. Lucy moved through those weeks with one hand often resting low over her middle, not in fear now, but in quiet wonder. The new house stood nearly finished by the end of May, with the east window set just as she had asked, and the porch boards planed smooth enough to walk barefoot on when summer came. Silas worked from sunrise until the light failed, but he did not move with the old lonely grind he had once carried. Now every board had a reason beyond shelter. Every nail he drove felt tied to something living. Lucy made the place a home before the last hinge was even hung. She set aside a corner shelf for dried herbs and kitchen things. She stitched curtains from the muslin she had bought months before in town. She planted beans, turnips, and calendula in the garden patch near the porch, then stood back in the evening light studying the rows as if trying to believe the ground would answer her care with growth. Silas watched her often from a short distance, not because he doubted what she was doing, because he liked seeing her on land that no longer felt borrowed under her feet. There was still caution in her sometimes, a pause before joy, a habit of bracing before good news settled, but it no longer ruled her the way it once had. By June, the old cabin had become more storehouse than home. They slept in the new house now with fresh pine walls holding the warmth of the day and the east window filling the room with pale gold every morning. Lucy had been right to ask for it. Sunrise felt different coming through that space. Cleaner, hopeful. The first morning they woke there, she stood by the window in her shift with one arm wrapped over herself and the light touching her face. Silas came up behind her and laid his hands gently at her waist. She rested back into him and said she had spent so much of her life waking up afraid that she still did not know what to do with mornings that felt kind. He kissed her temple and told her she could start by keeping them. She gave a soft breath that might have been a laugh. Then she took his hand and pressed it against her belly where the child had begun to make its quiet claim on the world. The birth pains came in July, just after a storm rolled through at sundown. The day had been heavy with heat. By evening, the clouds gathered over the ridge dark and swollen, and thunder moved across the valley like a wagon over hollow boards. Lucy had been sitting in the rocker by the east window with sewing in her lap when she stopped mid-stitch and gripped the armrest. Silas knew at once something had changed. She looked up at him, pale but steady, and said she thought it was time. For one foolish second he stood still as a post, feeling every fear he had held at bay come rushing at him all together. Then he moved. He got water heating. He laid clean cloths out like the neighbor woman had shown him. He sent the ranch hand from 2 miles over racing for Mrs. Ketter, who had delivered more babies than any one for 20 miles in any direction. Through it all, Lucy did not scream or collapse. She breathed through each pain with her jaw tight and her eyes fixed on something just beyond the room, as if will alone could carry her the rest of the way. The storm broke hard while she labored. Rain beat the roof. Wind shoved at the walls. Thunder rolled so deep it made the lantern glass tremble. Hours blurred. Mrs. Ketter arrived with her sleeves already rolled, all gossip and judgment burned out of her by the work at hand. She set to giving orders like a general. Silas was told where to stand, when to hold water, when to keep clear, and when to let Lucy crush the bones of his hand without complaint. He would have let her break every finger he owned. Nothing had ever made him feel so helpless and so needed at once. Lucy bore down through each wave of pain with a strength that left him half in awe and half in grief for all the hard things life had already demanded from her before this night. Sweat dampened her hair. Her face went white, then red, then white again. More than once she whispered that she could not do it. More than once he bent close and told her she already was. Near dawn the baby came. The storm had passed by then, leaving only dripping eaves and the far low rumble of clouds moving east. For one terrible second there was silence. Then a cry rose sharp and small into the room, and everything in Silas seemed to stop and start again in the same breath. Mrs. Ketter laughed first. Lucy cried next, though only once the child was laid against her chest. Silas stood by the bed staring like a man who had just been handed proof that mercy sometimes did arrive, even in a world not known for it. The baby was red-faced, furious, and alive. She had Lucy's eyes even then, dark and searching. Silas touched one finger to the tiny curl of her hand, and it closed around him with shocking strength. Lucy looked up from the child and said the name softly. Ruth. Silas nodded because his throat had gone too tight for words. The days after were filled with a kind of holy tiredness. Sleep came in scraps. Meals were late. The house stayed half in order and half in chaos. Yet Silas had never known deeper peace. Ruth cried with a fierce little voice that made itself known at all hours. She settled best when held against Lucy's chest or rocked near the east window in the first light of morning. Silas learned how to warm cloths, how to carry her with one broad hand supporting her head, how to read the difference between a hungry cry and a wet one. He was awkward at first and knew it. Lucy never mocked him. She only watched with that quiet patience of hers and corrected him when needed. Sometimes, in the blue hours before dawn, he would wake and see mother and child asleep together in the rocker, sunlight just beginning to brush the floorboards, and he would stand there for a long moment without moving. Some sights asked for stillness. Late one afternoon in August, after Ruth had finally gone down easy, Lucy stepped out onto the porch with Silas and sat beside him on the top step. The garden had come in better than either expected. Bean vines climbed their poles. Calendula burned orange and gold near the edge. The turnips were still mostly leaf, but strong leaf. The pasture rolled soft and green beyond it all, and the creek flashed where light caught it. Lucy leaned her shoulder to his and said she used to think home was something other people were born into. Something a person either got lucky enough to have or spent life begging to stay inside. Silas listened without interrupting. She said now she thought home might be something built instead, board by board, day by day, through work, through choosing, through staying when fear said run. He turned and looked at her then, not the girl who had dragged a broken bag through the red dirt to ask for water. Not only that girl. The woman who had crossed hunger, loss, winter, and all her own old fear to stand here with him now. He told her he had taken her for a joke the first day. Lucy gave him a tired half-smile and said she remembered. Silas nodded and looked out over the land. He said the truth was he had laughed because he did not know what courage looked like when it came dressed in dust and stubbornness. He thought he was seeing trouble. What he was seeing was the best thing that had ever walked onto his land. Lucy's eyes lowered at that, and he saw the old instinct in her to turn praise aside. Before she could, he reached for her hand. He told her he meant every word. She did not argue. She only held on. Years later, he would still remember that evening. The porch warm from the day's sun, the scent of earth and wood smoke and flowers she had planted with her own hands, Ruth sleeping inside, Lucy beside him, the whole ranch breathing easy in the last light. For a man who had once believed a life was only work, weather, and whatever grief a body could outlast, it felt almost too full to bear. But he bore it gladly. And every morning after that, Lucy opened the east window first. She let the light spill across the floor like a promise renewed. Ruth grew beneath that light. The garden changed with the seasons. The house held against winter, then spring, then winter again. They did not leave. They did not need to. The land had not started as hers, and it had not started as his salvation either. But together they made something stronger than luck and kinder than survival. A place chosen on purpose. A life neither of them had been foolish enough to dream of before it came. And Silas Boone never laughed at her again. Not because joy had left him, because now he knew exactly what she was worth.